So they say the third time's a charm. I hope they're correct, because this is the third time that I've attempted uploading this video. I'm very frustrated right now. We're going to be reading from The American Story. The first story that we are going to be reading takes place right after, well, not directly after, but after the Chicago fire. This is in 1885, and it's called Up from the Ashes into the Light. Immediately after the Great Fire, Chicago began to rebuild. Throughout downtown, new buildings were popping up, competing for tenants by offering modern conveniences like elevators and telephone wiring. Architects from all over the country fought for the chance to design new buildings in the capital of the Midwest. William Jenney was one of them. The son of a whaling captain, Jenney had traveled to the South Pacific in his youth and seen structures supported by interior frameworks of strong and flexible bamboo. Without the need for weight-bearing walls, these bamboo structures were open and bright, fine for the South Pacific perhaps, but in no way relevant to the frosty Great Lakes. Or were they? In Chicago, Jenney entered a competition to design Home Insurance's headquarters, where the main requirements were natural lighting with windows and the maximum number of small offices above the bank floor. With Chicago real estate prices climbing high, buildings had to climb skyward too. My cat on the counter. So naughty. Instead of sprawling out in large lots, but how to go up? 5 stories was as high as anyone had gone before. The massive weight of the brick and masonry construction made it impossible to go higher. This was the problem that nagged at William Jenney, driving him to fits of frustration. One afternoon, while struggling with his plan, he threw his pencil down in disgust and went home. His wife, surprised to see him so early, rose from her chair and searched for the nearest place to lay down her book, on top of a bird cage. Jenney stared at the delicate wire cage holding up the heavy volume. This was it. It was just as he had seen in the South Pacific so many years before. He could design a building whose weight was supported by an interior framework, like the skeleton of a mammal instead of the hard shell of a crab. There would be no need for heavy brick walls to support it. The cage would do that. Strong and lightweight steel beams and columns from the Pittsburgh steel mills would be the skeleton of the building, and a skin of windows could wrap around it, letting in light, light, and more light. With the commission secured, Jenney built the Home Insurance building. It rose into the Chicago skyline, reaching up into the light above everything else at an unbelievable 9 stories, America's first skyscraper. The Great Chicago Fire made it possible to start from scratch, just as new building technologies were created. Once the steel framework method caught on, skyscrapers began climbing higher and higher onto the shores of Lake Michigan. Today, Chicago is home to some of the most important buildings in the history of American architecture. You can see here is William Jenney and his wife in the bird cage, and then here is the first skyscraper. And then I had originally read 3 stories, one about Lizzie Borden, which is fascinating. If you get a chance, you can look her up. She may or may not have gotten away with a double murder. You be the deciding vote on that one. But that's a very interesting story, so you can look that one up on your own. And then this next one that we're going to read is going to be in your Maine State history book. This is called Remember the Maine. And this happened in 1898. The United States had been watching with considerable interest as Cuba began a revolution against the Spanish. To some Americans, Cuba's struggle for independence sounded exactly like the 13 Colonies' rebellion against Britain, and they cheered Cuba Libre, Free Cuba, in support of their neighbors south of Florida. Other Americans watched with considerable interest to see if Spain would finally be kicked out of the Americas. They had investments in Cuba, sugar and banana plantations, railroads, and tropical hardwoods. A Cuba free of Spanish control would be much better for U.S. business. And not only Cuba, but Puerto Rico too. There was a lot of money at stake. Americans sent aid to the Cuban revolutionaries, which made the Spanish furious. America is meddling in Cuba, said Spain. Spain is abusing the Cubans, said America. Tensions grew, and the U.S. Navy sent its glorious new steel battleship, the Maine, to Havana Harbor on a friendly visit. It lay at anchor in the harbor, an unmistakable sign to the Spanish that America was keeping a close and suspicious eye on them. The American newspapers, hungry for thrilling stories, played up every report coming out of Cuba. It was headlines that sold newspapers, and if the actual news reports weren't flashy enough, well, they'd have to be beefed up a bit. Enter fake news. Still happening today. When a reporter on assignment in Cuba complained to the publisher, William Randolph Hearst, that nothing seemed to be going on, he was told, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the stories and the war." Hearst wasn't kidding. Nothing would sell newspapers like a war. He ran so many outrageous and one-sided stories about the situation that Americans grew thirsty for Spanish blood. On the night of February 15, the USS Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor, exploded. 260 American sailors died. Headlines in the American newspaper screamed for revenge. Spain must have done it. What else could be the explanation? No other explanation was even considered. With no evidence at all that Spain had mined the battleship, the newspapers inflamed the public opinion, whipping America into a frenzy. "Remember the Maine," they cried in a righteous fury. Joining in the hue and cry were the business tycoons with investments at risk. Spain must be driven out. This was unsupportable. Of course, nobody really wanted Cuba to be independent. America wanted Cuba out of Spanish control and under its own control. Indeed, when President McKinley finally declared war on Spain, he said nothing at all about the independence for Cuba, but declare war he did. U.S. Navy ships in the Pacific began bombing the Philippines, Spain's last colony in that ocean. The Philippines quickly fell, and American Marines soon overran Cuba. The Secretary of State, John Hay, called the fight against Spain a splendid little war. It was over quickly, with little loss of life for American troops, and almost as soon as the Spanish flag was lowered in Cuba, American companies began taking over plantations. Remember the Maine. It was a convenient excuse for grabbing control in the Caribbean. America declared Cuba an independent state, but made sure that the country's wealth was firmly in the hands of the American owners. The Spanish-American War brought the Philippines, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico under U.S. protection for the first time. Independent Cuba simmered under American domination for almost 60 years, until the Communist Revolution led by Fidel Castro in 1959, the same year that Hawaii became the 50th state. And here are the pictures. You can see the Maine here being blown up, and here are the fake news reporters. And you're going to be reading about that in your Maine State History book. So this is just a double whammy for you. All right. I really hope it works this time. See you later.